The CIA is moving weapons in a bid to arm Syrian rebels as the US plan to aid Assad's foes takes shape. Here with WSJ exclusive is Wall Street Journal Pentagon correspondent Adam Enthouse. And there is Washington. Thank you, Adam, for being there. This, as I will emphasize again, is an exclusive. The arms are moving in. Tell us what's happening.
Well, what we've learned from diplomatic sources is that the CIA had been stocking up on Soviet-era weapons, including Kalashnikov ammunition and anti-tank weapons. And they've begun over a period of the last week or so moving that stockpile to Jordan to position it for what they expect to be a very intense training and vetting program, where for a period of 2 weeks they will work with small groups of 10 to 20 rebels to ensure that they meet U.S. standards and that they know how to use the weapons. And then they will begin to move into Syria, probably in the late July or early August timeframe.
Okay. Now, one of the things that they're also doing is there's going to be a no-fly zone or a partial no-fly zone, not across the whole of Syria. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that is a proposal that was made by Pentagon war planners because they felt that it would be necessary to provide some protection to the CIA operatives and also other personnel that would be involved in this arming and training program. However, that program, that idea of a no-fly zone is not moving forward at this time. It ran into considerable opposition within the White House, which is still hasn't ruled it out and could decide to look that way. But at this point, what the White House has given the CIA permission to do is to begin the arming process.
Now, one of the worries that some people have about the arming process is that these arms will end up in our enemies' hands, and we're not talking about the Assad forces or forces loyal to Assad, but folks that are linked with Al-Qaeda. This vetting process, it's got to be somewhat risky, hasn't it? You know, showing up and giving arms, and then it goes into the battlefield, and you don't really know where it's going to go, do you?
Right. Well, certainly this was the main reason why President Obama nixed this exact same proposal last year when it was presented to him. They were very concerned that Islamists would be able to get some of these weapons, particularly the more heavy weapons that could be used against tanks or, for example, anti-aircraft man-pads that can be used against aircraft. What's changed, according to administration officials, is that the CIA has a much better handle on who's who within the rebel opposition forces. And that's given them increasing confidence to go forward. But in many ways, what you're seeing here is a shift in strategy by the Obama administration that reflects a recognition of the changes that have occurred on the ground, where you have a resurgent Assad and an increasing number of Hezbollah fighters in Syria that have tipped the balance of the fight, and now the administration fears that the rebels could lose Aleppo in the coming months.
It sounds like it's going to get rather interesting over there. We appreciate your time, Adam Enthouse of the Wall.
The information used in this video will come from articles, documents, which were released to Judicial Watch, as well as documentation from a number of sources, in which some I will provide at the bottom of the description. Major unrest in Syria began on March 15, 2011, when the Arab Spring began and protesters marched in the capital of Damascus and the city of Aleppo, demanding democratic reform and the release of political prisoners. It was alleged to be triggered by an arrest of a teenage boy and his friends a few days earlier in the city of Dara for writing graffiti. Some people say the CIA had led the coup. There's also rumors that the Saudi intelligence, Mahabeth, were responsible for the Arab Spring to defeat and unrest the Shia-led governments. Assad security forces retaliated by opening fire, in which they fired back. Up until April of that year, the protesters predominantly demanded democratic reforms and an increase in freedoms and the abolition of the emergency law and an end to corruption. This was familiar, as this also happened in Egypt as well as in Iraq. The armed insurgency phase of the Syrian civil war began from July of 2011 to April of 2012. It was the initial armed insurgency. It was associated with the rise of armed oppositional militias across Syria and the beginning of armed rebellion against the authorities of the Syrian Arab Republic. Though armed insurrection incidents began as early as June of that year, when rebels killed 120 Syrian security personnel, the beginning of organized insurgency is typically marked by the formation of the Free Syrian Army on July 29, 2011. The Free Syrian Army are officers or former officers of the Syrian armed forces whose goal was to bring down the government of Bashar al-Assad. It was considered the main Syrian military defectors group and had success against vastly better armed government forces. And from July 2012 onward, the ill-disciplined infighting and lack of funding weakened the FSA, while other Islamist groups became dominant within the armed opposition and later swallowed up the remnants of the FSA. A document which was released by a FOIA request to Judicial Watch, which was sent to US CENTCOM, Central Command, the Department of the Navy, Department of Homeland Security, as well as other generals of the US Central Command. On page 3, headed under the general situation, they outlined the Syrian situation as this: A, internally events and taking a clear sectarian direction. B, the Salafist, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. C, the West, Gulf countries, and Turkey support the opposition, while Russia, China, and Iran support the regime. D is left blank. E, the regime's priority is to concentrate its presence in areas along the coast, Tartus and Latakia. However, it has not abandoned Homs because it controls the major transportation routes in Syria. The regime decreased its concentration in areas adjacent to the Iraqi borders, Al-Hasra and Deir Zior. They mentioned Al-Qaeda as well as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which are also named the Islamic State and the Levant. A, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is familiar with Syria. The AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, trained in Syria and then infiltrated into Iraq. B, AQI supported the Syrian opposition from the beginning, both ideologically and through the media. The AQI declared its opposition of Assad's government because it considered it a sectarian regime targeting Sunnis. C, AQI conducted a number of operations in several Syrian cities under the name of Jaish al-Nusra, one of its affiliates. D, AQI, through the spokesman of the Islamic State of Iraq, Abu Muhammad al-Adani, declared the Syrian regime as the spearhead of what he is naming Jibra al-Radufia, or the forefront of the Shiites because of its Syrian declaration of war on the Sunnis. Additionally, he is calling on the Sunnis in Iraq, especially the tribes in the border regions in between Iraq and Syria, to wage war against the Syrian regime, regarding Syria as an infidel regime for its support to the infidel party Hezbollah and other regimes he considers dissenters like Iran and Iraq. In the summer of 2012, CIA Director David Petraeus proposed a covert program of arming and training rebels. Initially, then US President Barack Obama rejected the proposal, but later agreed, partially due to lobbying by foreign leaders, including King Abdullah II of Jordan and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It was codenamed Timber Sycamore and was similar to other Pentagon or CIA-run weapons routing and training programs that were established in previous decades to support foreign rebel forces, most notably Operation Cyclone, when the United States used the Pakistan ISI to fund and train Mujahideen rebels to fight against the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. The Saudis and the Gulf began supplying weapons and funding, and were the major proprietors of said funding. Greg Miller and Adam Entos of the Washington Post stated that the operation has served as the centerpiece of the US strategy to press Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to step aside. The program's principal backers were the United States and Saudi Arabia, but it was also supported by some other regional Arab governments and by the United Kingdom. While Saudi Arabia provided more money and weaponry, the United States leads training in military equipment. The program was based in Jordan due to the country's proximity in the battlefields in Syria. According to a report by the New York Times, the program initially allowed US forces to train Syrian rebels in the use of military equipment, but not to directly provide the equipment itself. A few months after its creation, it was amended to allow the CIA to train and equip rebel forces. Saudi Arabia had provided military equipment and covert financing of rebel forces, and which has also provided by Qatar, Turkey, and Jordan. Syria was in trouble as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey shipped thousands of rifles, hundreds of machine guns, large amounts of ammunition to Syrian rebels in 2012 before the program's launch. The CIA helped arrange some of the arms purchases for the Saudis, including a large deal in Croatia in 2012. A classified US State Department cable signed by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton reported that Saudi donors were a major support for Sunni militant forces globally, and some American officials worried that rebels being supported had ties to Al-Qaeda. Turkish journalist Fedim Tekashin of Al Monitor quoted, "The groups that were educated and equipped by the United States west of the Euphrates are now fighting against the groups east of the Euphrates that have been also educated and equipped by the United States," end quote. However, you wouldn't know this, though from watching or reading mainstream media, including CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times had described the Turkish-backed rebels only as fighters the United States had long rejected as extremists, criminals, and thugs, were now moderate rebels. Other people would come out in defense of the program, including Charles Lister, an analyst with the Middle East Institute, Shane Bauer, a reporter with Mother Jones, although some of the Turkish-backed fighters currently attacking the Kurds did in fact fight with the FSA back in 2012 and 2013, some of them did not. Many of these fighters were 10 years old when the conflict started. Others noted how plenty of Syrian rebels were radicalized over the course of a bloody conflict in which the representatives of Bashar al-Assad's regime used chemical weapons, barrel bombs, and starvation against them. There were no winners here. Both sides, the Assad government and the Islamic militants, used unconventional methods to get rid of each other. However, there was only one backer of the Syrian jihadists that had a main interest, that had also other foreign interests involved: the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Sycamore was run by the Military Operations Command in Amman, Jordan, which provided Kalashnikov assault rifles, mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, Tau anti-tank guided missiles, night vision goggles, pickup trucks, and other weapons to prospective Syrian rebel forces, in which many of them were foreign rebels coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria. Many of the weapons were purchased in the Balkans or other locations in Eastern Europe and then routed to Syrian rebel forces and training camps by Jordanian security services. CIA paramilitary operatives trained Syrian rebels in the use of weaponry. According to American officials, the program was highly effective, training and equipping thousands of US-backed fighters to make substantial battlefield gains. American officials stated that the program began to lose effectiveness after Russia intervened militarily during the Syrian civil war. David Ignatius, writing in the Washington Post, remarked that while the CIA program ultimately failed in its objective of removing Assad from power, it was hardly bootless. The program pumped many hundreds of millions of dollars to many dozens of militia groups. One knowledgeable official estimates that the CIA-backed fighters may have killed or wounded over 100,000 Syrian soldiers and their allies over the past 4 years, between 2013 and 2017. However, as the insurgency began over the course of the next 5 years, the program would take on a nefarious turn. US-backed rebels often fought alongside Al-Qaeda's al-Nusra Front. Some US military members began tweeting, "Who are we fighting for? And who are we fighting against?" While some of the US supplied weapons ended up in the hands of the al-Nusra Front, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, which had been a major concern of the Obama administration when the program was first proposed, Obama had not ended the program. The program continues to remain classified, and many details about the program remain unknown, including the total amount of support, the range of weapons involved, and the depth of training provided, the types of US trainers involved, and the exact rebel groups being supported. However, an opinion piece in the Canberra Times noted that 2,000 tons of Soviet-era weapons were delivered to Aqaba as recently as April of 2016. The US delivered weapons via Ramstein Air Base in Germany, possibly in breach of German laws. According to American and Jordanian officials, weapons shipped into Jordan by the CIA and Saudi Arabia was stolen by Jordanian intelligence officials in the General Intelligence Directorate and sold on the black market. The magnitude of the theft amounted to millions of dollars, and FBI officials state that some of the stolen weapons were later used to kill 2 American contractors, 2 Jordanians, and 1 South African at a police training station in Jordan in the 2015 Amman shooting attack. arms received via timber Sycamore have flooded Middle Eastern black markets with heavy weaponry. Jordanian officials state that Jordanian intelligence officers who stole the program's weapons used the profits to purchase luxury items with knowledge of superior officers. According to Jordanian officials, several intelligence officers were fired, but their profits were not confiscated. Meanwhile, according to IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot, he acknowledged for the first time in 2019 that Israel had indeed provided weaponry to Syrian rebel groups in the Golan Heights during the country's 7-year civil war, separate for timber Sycamore. Up until that point, Israel would say officially only that it had given humanitarian aid to Syrian opposition groups across the border, while denying or refusing to comment on reports that it had supplied them with arms as well. In an interview with the British Sunday Times, Eisenkot said that Israel had indeed provided light weapons to the rebel groups along the border, saying it was for self-defense. Israel's supply of weapons to these opposition groups had been reported for years, both by the Syrian army looking to discredit the rebels as stooges of the Zionists and by the opposition groups interested in expanding their cooperation with Israel in the fight against Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, but it was never confirmed by Israeli officials. According to Eisenkot, we carried out thousands of attacks in recent years without taking responsibility and without asking for credit. According to then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who also dropped the policy of general acknowledgement and specific ambiguity in Syria, which Israel says that it does carry out operations in Syria without claiming individual strikes. Prior to the Syrian civil war, southern Syria and northern Jordan were a conduit for other smuggling operations. The advent of the war transformed the region into a center for smuggling weapons, and the more formal support provided by timber Sycamore only intensified the scale of smuggling operations on the border. An investigation by journalists Phil Sands and Suha Maya revealed that rebels supplied with weapons from the Amman MOC sold a portion of them to local arms dealers, often to raise cash to pay additional fighters. According to rebel forces, the Bedouins would then trade the weapons to the Islamic State in Levant, who would place orders using the encrypted WhatsApp messaging service. Plenty of the Syrian rebels, both Arabs and Kurds, both Islamists and secularists, fought not only against the Assad government, but also against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, as regional differences would commence. There were, however, other rebel groups that were dominated by violent Salafists and so-called jihadis from the start, who also bragged about fighting alongside Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. The truth is that many of the rebel forces who are committing war crimes against the Kurds were also committing war crimes in the early years of the Syrian civil war, as the United States and Saudi Arabia turned a blind eye. In July of 2017, anonymous officials stated that then President Donald Trump, in consultation with National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and then CIA Director Mike Pompeo, had decided to phase out support for anti-Assad Syrian rebel forces, possibly redirecting resources to fighting the Islamic State in Levant, to offering rebel forces defensive capabilities, or to other operators in the region. The officials said that the decision was made prior to Trump's participation in the G20 summit and July 7th meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Several officials characterized the decision as a major concession to Russia, with one remarking Putin won in Syria. However, another official stated that ending the program was not a major concession due to Assad's recent victories in the Syrian civil war, but rather a signal to Putin that the administration wants to improve ties to Russia. Some members of the Obama administration reportedly had wished to scrap the program because some rebels armed and trained by the program had joined the Islamic State in Levant and related groups. However, it didn't stop Obama, Clinton, Samantha Power from stopping the program in its entirety when the information came from intelligence sources that the weapons had gone to the Salafist jihadist groups. Robert Baer, a former CIA officer and CNN contributor, strongly criticized the Trump administration's cancellation of the program, calling it a strategic mistake and a gift to Vladimir Putin. In contrast, Thomas Joyceland of the Weekly Standard defended Trump's decision, arguing there is no evidence that any truly moderate force is effectively fighting against Assad. According to a document, Train and Equip Program for Syria, Authorities, Funding, and Issues for Congress, written by Amy Belasco, a specialist in U.S. defense policy and budget, in which the document is dated June 9th, 2015, in which the proposals in fiscal year 2016 under the headliner Syria Train and Equipment Proposals. Under the headliner, the points of the proposals were the following. 1, proposed reporting and certification requirements in the House and Senate versions of the fiscal year 2016 National Defense Authorization Act S 1376 would require the administration to report to Congress on the potential provision of U.S. support and protection to program participants upon their return to Syria from training locations outside of the country. Some supporters of the program and advocates of a more robust anti-Assad strategy for the United States argue that the United States should be prepared and willing to protect U.S. trainees from potential attacks from pro-Assad forces and extremist groups through defensive fire, air cover, intelligence, or resupply. Critics of deeper U.S. involvement in the Syria conflict argue that such protection may entail confrontation and armed conflict between U.S. forces and the Syrian government or other actors with unpredictable consequences. Point 2, proposed restrictions in the House enrolled fiscal year 2016 NDAA HR 1735 on the provision of U.S. assistance to those found to have misused U.S. assistance reflect some members' concerns for ensuring that U.S. assistance supports only these purposes that Congress set out for the program in fiscal year 2015 legislation. Specifically, some members of Congress seek to ensure that U.S. assistance is used by U.S. trained Syrians to combat the Islamic State and not to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad or for other purposes. Administration officials insist that trainees and beneficiaries are receiving assistance to enable them first and foremost to protect civilians, opposition-held areas, and themselves from the forces of the Islamic State. Point 3, proposed new reporting requirements in the House enrolled fiscal year 2016. The National Defense Authorization Act would require the administration to report on the feasibility and potential costs of operations to establish so-called safe zones or no-fly zones in the areas of Syria. This proposed change, while not involving the train and equipment program directly, may reflect preferences expressed by some Syrian opposition activists and their U.S. supporters, including some members of Congress, for a broader scope and scale of U.S. assistance under the train and equipment program and or for parallel U.S. military intervention to protect Syrian civilians. However, other Syrian groups and other U.S. observers may reject deeper U.S. involvement. However, with the United States still in Syria and Israel continuing to bomb Syrian outposts as well as Hezbollah outposts, it brings forth to light a much deeper problem. What is the Israeli position in Syria? In July of 2017, Israel's defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, said that while the rebels are not our friends, they are all versions of Al-Qaeda. Israel could not allow a man like Bashar al-Assad to remain in power. Keeping Assad in power is not in our security interests. As long as he is in power, Iran and Hezbollah will be in Syria. He said that Israel had no interest in entering the Syrian civil war, but there were red lines Israel had set, such as the smuggling of sophisticated weaponry to Hezbollah and Iran's presence on its borders. Later, in July of 2017, the Israeli government said it opposed the ceasefire agreement in southern Syria and that the United States, Russia, and Jordan had reached a week prior that envisaged establishing de-escalation zones along Syria's borders with both Jordan and Israel, as that would legalize Iran's presence in Syria. On several occasions, Israel reportedly carried out or supported attacks on Hezbollah and Iranian targets within Syrian territories or Lebanon. Hezbollah and Iranian proxy forces were helping Assad fight against the Syrian jihadists, which were supported by Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. One of the first reliably reported incidents of this kind took place on January 30th of 2013 when Israeli aircraft struck a Syrian convoy allegedly transporting Iranian weapons to Hezbollah. However, the Syrian government under Assad declined to answer, stating that the conspiracy promoted by Israel is unfounded. In 2016, from the territory of the Golan Heights, which was occupied by Israel since 1967 and annexed in 1981, the Israeli military began to offer medical assistance to Syrian jihadists in their fight against the Assad government. Over 4,000 of them, mostly men who fought alongside al-Nusra and the Islamic State, have been treated at his Jewish Golan Heights hospitals. The Ba'athist government in Iraq faced the same international condemnation and U.S. implication of producing chemical and biological weapons for Al-Qaeda. The same was said of Muammar Gaddafi, in which Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton pressured the Obama administration to enter a war in Libya. Obama reluctantly agreed, even though Vice President Biden and Obama were against the conflict. Obama would later say it was his greatest mistake in his 8 years as president. With the end of the Timber Sycamore program and the continuing sectarian divide in Syria, Libya, and Iraq, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel continue to benefit from the demise of Shia-led countries and the destabilization of the Middle East in the hopes of adhering to the goals of previous foreign policy outlines like the Oded-Yinon Plan, the Paul Wolfowitz Doctrine, and the Project for New American Century. The neocons are not right, are not left, but they are synonymous with power. And power corrupts absolutely.
دور و زر و تدبیر نمودن توانی دور و زر و تدبیر نمودن توانی دنیا شده